morning. My name is Jessica Williams, and I serve as chair and conference coordinator for Abuse Hurts. I'm a survivor and strong proponent of hope in the journey of translating surviving into thriving, bringing awareness about the many faces of abuse and creating a safe space for conversation that promotes empowerment is an invigorating conviction that fuels my passion for bringing lasting change. The privilege of being part of this Hope Conference series and bringing it to life is living in a real-time dream coming true. Together is truly the only way we can effectively break silence, build communities, and deliver hope in the tangible ways that makes facing tomorrow not just an ability, but a possibility with unlimited potential. It's an honor to be here with all of you who share a similar passion. I will be moderating Stream 1, Awakening Our Communities, and I'm pleased to kick off Session 1, Coercive Control, Deepening Our Understanding of Domestic Violence with Amy Munroe. If you're in the wrong session, please navigate to the session you're looking for through the menu on the left of your screen. Click the Sessions button, and then click on the session you'd like to attend. It is my pleasure to introduce Amy Munroe, Intervention Lead with Sagesse. Amy Munroe, RSW, is the intervention lead at Sagesse, a provincial organization dedicated to empowering individuals, organizations, and communities to disrupt structures of domestic abuse. Throughout the course of her academics and work experience in the sector, Amy developed a passion for deconstructing professionalized ways of supporting folks to move to innovative and client-centered approaches, particularly through the peer support model. Amy is dedicated to the mission of ending domestic abuse in Alberta through her work with Sagesse. Amy completed her education at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta in 2015 and has been working in the domestic violence sector since 2014. Welcome, Amy.
Thanks so much, Jessica, for that kind welcome. I really appreciate it. And good morning to all of the participants. Thank you for sharing space with me this morning. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you a little bit about coercive control. So I'm going to jump right in. I believe that you started out with a land acknowledgement, but I do want to just situate myself being in Calgary, Alberta. And as an organization, we operate across the province. And so as we gather together today, and particularly for me in my context for the province of Alberta, Sagesse would like to acknowledge that we are all on the traditional territories in Alberta of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. We acknowledge all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands, and that many come to live, work, and volunteer in Alberta, enriching our communities. So I want to start out with talking to you a little bit about Sagesse, who we are as an organization, just to give you some context into who we are. So we are an organization that's sort of uniquely positioned to disrupt structures of domestic abuse. We not only make a difference one life at a time through intervention and peer support programs, but we also work to make large-scale societal change through education, collective impact, and advocacy. With innovation as our cornerstone, we work to make a difference one life at a time through intervention and peer support programs. So Sagesse is the French feminine word for wisdom, and that's what our organization is called. We're anglicizing it. Probably lots of folks, if you are French, you would probably pronounce it sagesse, which is also a correct way to pronounce it. So I'm going to start by talking to you a little bit about what coercive control is. This is a term that is starting to gain a lot of popularity in domestic abuse sectors and outside of or cross-sectoral. And so really I want to start with sort of this understanding that domestic abuse is more than physical and sexual violence. And I think that a lot of folks do know that and recognize that already. Coercive control is really a pattern of behavior. And it is the repetitive use of tactics to regulate and dominate a person's daily life and restrict their personal liberties. This directly comes out of research from Evan Stark, who coined coercive control and has done decades of work around coercive control. Coercive control is like a Jenga tower. It's all the ways that someone might make another person feel unsteady. It taps away at what makes up a person's sense of self, or taps away at their support system to isolate and trap them. Coercive control is also like an iceberg. It is often unseen from the surface, and there's a lot that's going on underneath. Coercive control is like life inside of an invisible cage. So it traps that person inside a cage of coercion control, and it keeps a person isolated and alone. There's a lot of different ways coercive control can look. At the end of the day, what's most important to recognize is that it is a pattern of behavior. One of the reasons why we don't talk about abuse from the lens of the different types of abuse, so there's the sexual, physical, emotional, religious, spiritual, financial, all of those different types of abuse are ways that people do experience abuse. However, they don't often happen in isolation. A person doesn't just experience financial abuse, or they don't just experience physical abuse. Often there is a meshing of all of the different ways that can look, and that forms these patterns of behaviors that involves these repetitive use of tactics to regulate and dominate a person's life. As we're going, if you have questions, please obviously feel free to use the Q&A. I'm happy to answer questions throughout the presentation if one pops up, and then obviously we're going to have a Q&A at the end. I am very used to doing these presentations from an interactive nature. I really like to interact with the crowd, so it's a bit different for me to be just talking at you. So I really welcome any questions or any feedback or any comments that come throughout the presentation as well. I won't be able to see it, but I know that Jessica or Kim will be able to stop me and let me know. So coercive control, we kind of think about it in three different ways. So, I'm just realizing now, sorry that I didn't put my thing around. So we can kind of see it in three different ways. So it is often not obvious. So from an outsider's perspective, we might not notice these behaviors because they are intentionally hidden a lot of the time. They're often low level, so the control tactics are subtle and often appear minor. People don't think that they need to check in because it doesn't seem like it's domestic abuse necessarily. Coercive control is also cumulative. While those tactics may seem significant by themselves, the tactics can build to have a really massive impact on someone's life to make them feel isolated and trapped. Also frequent. These tactics are used frequently, but it's important to differentiate that they do not always happen in a pattern. One of the struggles that we have, or one of the things that we talk a lot about is, there's a common phrase that talks about red flags. How do you recognize the red flags? And one of the challenges with talking about red flags, there's a couple of them, right? One is that it can unintentionally sort of place blame on a victim to say, well, if you had just noticed these red flags or you knew these red flags, then maybe it wouldn't have happened to you, right? So that's one way. The other thing is that list, those red flags, is not an exhaustive list. There's no way for us to be able to put on a list of paper a way that a person experiences coercive control, because it is so unique to the person and to the relationship, whatever that looks like. So when we're talking about coercive control and we're talking about the fact that it's often low level, it's not injurious in the traditional sense, although it might be, but it's cumulative in its impact. We have to be really careful about talking about because what one red flag could look like in one relationship may not be a red flag in another, right? And so just as much as we don't want to ignore what could be, we also want to be really conscious about making assumptions on about what is and what isn't. Well, I want to talk a little bit about some of the common tactics that are used in coercive control, because it really creates these invisible chains and a sense of fear that pervades all elements of a person's life. So one of the realms that common tactics of coercive control can include is financial, right? So we talk about different things around money and saving and spending. Some of the examples that we have come across at our organization is folks who obviously don't have access to any bank account, or it's a shared account that they don't actually have access to. It's shared money, and so even after they have left a relationship, they may not have access to that relationship. This is also true in terms of accessing resources, particularly when it comes to folks who are experiencing abuse who have a high socioeconomic status. On paper, they have a high socioeconomic status. And that actually precludes them from a lot of services because it appears like they should have the resources in order to get support. When in reality, what might be happening is that they have on paper all of this money, and they have no way in which that they actually get to use it or that they can use it. And so when we see folks that are at a higher socioeconomic status, sometimes they are not even able to access services because on paper they have, it looks like they have this money. Another realm is medical. So some of the health and well-being decisions. We did quite a few presentations throughout COVID around the impacts of COVID. And a lot of these tactics are things that we don't necessarily think about day to day, right? So when it comes to during the pandemic, right, during lockdown periods, folks bringing over people when they weren't supposed to, or the person who's, using these tactics, just deciding to bring people over without considering or caring about what the other person thinks, or perhaps limiting or taking away their personal, their PPE, right? Or telling them that they have to go to work even if they're sick and that they just need to hide it. There's all kinds of ways that this can look. This can be also true in terms of seniors who are experiencing abuse, right? So people who have medical decisions, who are withholding medication or using too much medication. There's all kinds of ways that can look from a medical perspective. Another sort of common theme of coercive control is gaslighting. And this is a pretty interesting term right now in this day and age, because I think gaslighting in a lot of contexts has started to become a little, I'm trying to think of what the right word is, but it's sort of becoming a little bit misunderstood, and people are using it in contexts in which it's not actually gaslighting. And so the term itself has become a little bit confusing because it is so well used or overused in society. We see this all the time in social media platforms like TikTok, talking about gaslighting. But gaslighting really at the core of it, right, is doubting your memory, doubting your decisions, doubting your capabilities, because of the way that the person who is using abuse is kind of using and twisting that information. So an example of this is when an abuser states information that directly contradicts facts that you know are true in order to distort your perception of reality. It can cause you to stop knowing what's real or trusting yourself. That is really at the core of what gaslighting is, right? And that can show up in all kinds of different ways for folks who are impacted or experiencing coercive control. And we see this all the time at our organization, and it looks so different, right? The tactics of gaslighting can look very different because it's intended to be unique to the person, right? What one person is going to make them feel like they're doubting themselves and their capabilities will be very different for another person. And so gaslighting is not something you can pin to say, this is exactly gaslighting, because it is dependent on the relationship and what's going on. Another realm that we talk about in terms of coercive control is technology. So this is obviously, as we know, in this virtual day and age, this is something that is hugely pervasive right now. Things like inappropriate access to technology, obtaining passwords without a person's consent, tracking their location. It can be finding ways to be able to intercept and be watching the person using technology. There's a lot that can encompass, or hacking emails, or kind of using those tactics to intimidate or threaten somebody else. And so this is something that we have seen a huge increase around in the last, I would say, in the last few years, and particularly obviously since COVID as well. Another sort of tactic or realm that's used is the monitoring or restricting or controlling of relationships, right? So that can include things like controlling who the person is in contact with, controlling who their friends are, calling them incessantly, using threats. So for example, if somebody is in a queer relationship, or a 2S LGBTQ+ relationship, right, threatening to out them as a way to sort of maintain that control and maintain power over that person is a huge way that somebody is monitored or restricted. Even just undermining them in the relationship is a huge part. And this also can have a huge impact on kids, right? We talk about, obviously, the folks that are part of this relationship are part of the dynamic in which coercive control is present. But there is obviously a huge impact on kids too, because kids can also be used as a tactic sometimes. We see this a lot in the justice system, right? So using kids, or kind of lengthening out or having lengthy custody battles, using kids to kind of control or manipulate what they say in court to make sure that it leans a certain way, right? That there are all of these different ways that can look in terms of using kids as tactics, or threatening to call children and services if the person doesn't comply, saying that the person is an unfit parent to be able to take care of their children, right? This can look all kinds of different ways in terms of those tactics. And at the end of the day, what they really do, right, is that they create these invisible chains and this sense of fear that pervades all elements of a person's life. And it also limits human agency by depriving individuals of their liberty, right? And that's a huge piece of coercive control, is that it limits humans' rights. We see this not only just in coercive controlling relationships related to domestic abuse, but we see this in other forms of coercive control, like cults, or extremist groups, right? That there are these really vast limits on human rights and depriving people of their individual liberty. And that's sort of at the core of coercive control. It feels like an ever-changing rule book that has to be adhered to. And this is key also, right? What is today a tactic that gets used, tomorrow it might be something completely different. And so the person who is experiencing that abuse or that coercive control isn't ever able to really get a handle on what these tactics or how these patterns exactly are going to look, because it can change quite frequently. Coercive control moves through spaces, right? It does not stay in one realm of someone's life. It affects them everywhere, even if things aren't necessarily happening in all of those spaces. So an example of this is a tactic of control is to call the person continuously while they're at work, while they're running errands, and really gives them no reprieve, right? Another example is the tactics of coercive control might also impact a person's ability to do their work or be present with friends, right? Even just by that impact. And so we see that coercive control, you know, when you think about domestic abuse, you think about people experiencing abuse, you probably imagine, or even I, right? Even I imagine often that it's happening inside of the home in a really particular place, or maybe an isolated incident like at a grocery store, something that you might see something that you're like, ooh, that doesn't look good, right? The reality is that it crosses all realms. It crosses all spheres of a person's life. And it doesn't just impact a person in one area or just in the home when they're with that person. It is impacting them every moment of every day in all of these different spheres. And it does that because the whole purpose of coercive control, right, is to regulate and dominate a person's life. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple of facts. I'm going to take a sip, though, of a drink. So a couple of facts. About only 30% of people across Canada self-report domestic abuse to the police. So for us in our local context, we know domestic abuse is happening commonly across Calgary. And we also know that there are reasons why people might not be reporting to police. And I think that this is true for places across Canada. Some of those reasons can be things like distrust of authorities, particularly if people have had negative experiences where police have not believed them in the past, then they're much less likely to report in the future. They may not report to police because they might not have it might not be safe to access any formal resources, right? Depending on the particular context and the level of control that's happening, people may not have access to resources. Another thing is that they might need or want to stay in the relationship, right? And this is something that I think we don't talk enough about in the coercive control and domestic abuse realm, right? There's a lot of focus on how does the person leave? How does the person exit? Well, this is not necessarily always the right or the best choice for the person. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides later on. But that might be another reason why they don't report to police. The places where people are turning to support are 36% of people turn to formal supports like shelters and social workers. 68% of people turn to informal supports first, right? So when people are disclosing their experiences of abuse, they're not telling necessarily a police officer, a social worker, or somebody a formal support first. The vast majority of folks are telling a hairdresser, a yoga teacher, a neighbor, a friend, or a family member that they feel safe with, right? And so this is really, really key for us to understand in the domestic abuse and the coercive control context, the key of informal supporters and how informal supporters play such a big role. 80% of people experience domestic abuse in the workplace. So domestic abuse, like we were just talking about, doesn't only happen behind closed doors. It can be seen in public spaces. And some of those most, reported tactics that we were talking about before are calling, incessantly, texting all the time, stalking a partner at their place of work, sending things over to make sure that that all of the coworkers know that that person is, there and knows that the person is there, and all of those types of things. And 82% of Canadians who experience domestic abuse say that their work has been negatively impacted, it has negatively impacted their performance because of things like feeling distracted, tiredness, showing up late for work, interruptions at work from the person who's using abuse, poor concentration, right? And so this really highlights that people can be impacted differently when experiencing domestic abuse, might not match the assumptions we make about how someone might show signs. Few other facts for everybody. From 20 to 2021, family violence increased by 3%. 2021 marked the 5th consecutive year police reported family violence increased. 6 in 10 Indigenous women have experienced some form of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. It's important to highlight this because the experiences of intimate partner violence, there is most likely aspects of coercive control occurring too. And it is happening in really high rates among Indigenous women. And more than 55% of women with disabilities have reported intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Some of these stats, they come from Stats Canada 2021, 2018. Those are the two main sources that we got those from. And so we talked just briefly in one of those stats, we talked about how 80% of folks are telling an informal supporter first. And so I want to talk a little bit about the role of informal supporters. Key to this is recognizing that an informal supporter does not have to be an expert, right? We often think like, if I'm going to support somebody who's experiencing abuse, I need to know exactly what to say. I need to know exactly what to say and the right way to send them, or what if I do something, what if I make things worse, right? I think that this is a really common experience. You don't actually have to be an expert to be an informal supporter. One of the things that we do at our organization is we have run a campaign for a long time called Real Talk. And it's about being an informal support to somebody who is experiencing abuse. And so REAL is we use it as an acronym. Is that the right phrase? To talk about how to engage as an informal supporter. So first up is the R, which is recognize, right? So if you are able to acknowledge and recognize the different ways that abuse and coercive control can show up, right? That allows you to have a better understanding of what you might see or what you might want to reach out and ask somebody about. The second part is empathize, right? And so really sitting with the person, not trying to fix it for people, not trying to jump to here's what you can do and this and this and this, because a lot of the time people are going to be checking and assessing to see whether or not you're a safe person to continue to share things with. And so the biggest thing that you can do is sit with that person, empathize with that person, and recognize that your role is to be there and to sit in that, and then to help support in whatever way that they are asking you for. Another part of this, or the third part of that, is ask, right? So domestic abuse, although we have seen really big gains in terms of it turning from a public to a private sort of sector, or a public versus private issue, it can still be a really difficult question or a difficult thing to bring up. But the thing that we talk about is that it's easy to ask, right? We can have real conversations with people and we can ask the question, are you okay? Do you want to talk about it? Can I support you with something, right? So just starting with simple questions, and then we allow the person that may be experiencing it to have the power to decide whether or not they want to share that or not. And then of course it has refer in here. It should be an L, which would be the acronym for real, which is listen, right? And so really listening, again, empathizing with the person. When we do this, we end up having a positive social response. And those positive social responses include the acknowledgement of the abuse, removing blame, honoring the person's experience, and honoring the person's individual choice in that experience, right? And so really getting away from what the person should do, how they should leave, what they need to do in order to leave that situation, right? And rather just sitting and honoring what they're already doing and what their choices are around that. because it is a hard situation as it is. And so as an informal support, you have a lot of power in that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some clinical considerations that we use at our organization around coercive control. And these are the key models that we use when we're working with clients who are experiencing coercive control. So first of all, we use a trauma and violence informed practice. This is, sort of a big, trauma informed is a big buzzword these days. There's not a lot of folks who don't sort of know what trauma informed means, but from our context, right, it means a few different things, right? That there are no surprises, that we are really transparent with clients, that we prepare people for experiences. So for example, what that looks like at our organization in our peer support groups is when somebody is registered for a program, we might ask them, do you want us to walk you through what a first session might look like, right? We can't give you all of the answers. We don't have control over everything that's going to happen, but here's some information about what you can reasonably expect. That sort of helps to take away some of that potential apprehension that there, or a surprise around what that could look like to the best of our ability, while still recognizing that not everything is in our control. Another part of trauma and violence informed practice is not labeling. So people are people and not labels or their symptoms. And this includes, right, not labeling somebody as experiencing trauma. We don't know, right? Yes, it's true that most of us have experienced trauma in our life to some degree, but we don't know what the person exactly is experiencing, and we don't have the ability to label what that looks like. We also are really conscious about not controlling what happens in our peer support programs. We don't get to decide what happens in group. And so we allow people, participants, and we allow things to go where they need to go. And that also allows people to take back some of that power that has been possibly been taken away from them through their coercive control experience. It's also talking about letting people build connections on their own terms and at their own pace, and not kind of trying to get them to connect in a certain way or build community in a certain way. So that's some of the ways that the trauma and violence informed practice shows up. Second consideration is an intersectional approach. So it refers to an intersectional approach, refers to the various forms of inequality or inequity, and oppression, which often operate together, such as things like class and race and gender and sexuality. So intersectionality means that experiences of coercive control will look and feel different for people based on intersections, based on the way that their experience of what's been going on. And so really bringing that approach in and acknowledging that as part of a person's whole human beingness and their experience. Third consideration is gender transformative. I'm going to talk about that in a couple of slides. But gender transformative is really the opportunity to actively challenge gender norms, promote positions of social and political influence for women in communities, and address power inequities between persons of different genders. The reality is that people experience abuse across the gender spectrum, right? And so we really have to recognize that a gender transformative approach is what is necessary in order to support folks who are experiencing coercive control, because that happens across a gender spectrum. Another one is client-centered. So we center the work that we do around the experiences of clients, and we use the information that they give us to structure meaningful programs and services that align with our clients' experience of abuse. Co-shared experience. So we are not the experts in people's lives, which means we have to create a co-shared understanding of what coercive control looks like and how that can show up for people. And lastly, we talk about a feedback-informed approach. So Sagesse uses a culture of feedback model and approach to our work, which is an ever-evolving way to ensure program integrity, right? We asked ourselves the question, how do we actually know our programs are best serving clients if we don't ask the questions, if we don't actually elicit feedback and do something with that feedback? So it requires us to practice giving and receiving feedback on a continual basis. That also empowers clients to take an active seat in their healing journey. When they believe that they don't have a voice, or they are able to take back some of that power and have a voice and know that it is being heard. So culture of feedback asks us that when we receive feedback, we actually do something with that. And it is not just a survey that folks fill out and then it just kind of goes away and there's nothing that happens around that. So one of the benefits of bringing up coercive control with clients? Well, there are quite a few. Some of the benefits are the validation and connection that it brings for folks. It allows us to have a greater spectrum of experiences, right? So there are models out there around domestic abuse. You know, you've probably heard of the cycle of violence, you know, the honeymoon, the tension, and the sort of critical incident that happens. You've probably heard of the wheel of I can't remember exactly what's called, the course or the control wheel, something like that. The challenge, the potential challenge with those other models of abuse is that they're kind of presented in a bit of a linear way, and they're also kind of limited in how people can experience abuse, right? So even in the cycle of violence, it talks about it in the terms of this, like there's the honeymoon stage, then there's the tension building stage, and then there's this explosion or this incident that happens. Well, if we think back to what coercive control is, that it's frequent, that it's often low level, that it's cumulative, right? That there's not necessarily a huge blow up or a huge explosion or experience that happens. There may be, certainly, but there may also not be. And so what it allows us to do with clients is that we are able to have a greater spectrum of experiences and many, many more people saying, oh yeah, my experience totally fits within this like kind of understanding or definition of coercive control, right? Because a lot of the time we hear people being like, I don't know if this is what I experienced, like, I don't know if this is abuse, I don't know if this is considered valid. But when you talk about coercive control as a pattern of tactics that are used to regulate and dominate a person's life, a lot of folks are like, whoa, that's exactly what happened, right? That's exactly what this looks like for me. And there wasn't necessarily the presence of this physical or sexual violence or something that might be more, have a more bigger incident, if that makes sense. So coercive control also centers unique client experiences. It reduces the shame and stigma, right? Because it allows for a broader experience and contextualization of those experiences. It can be gender transformative, so recognizing that anybody can experience coercive control and anyone can perpetrate coercive control along that gender spectrum. It builds a shared understanding of people's experiences, and it's cross-experiential, right? People can relate, people can understand that lived impact or that shared impact that it has. I realize I'm going to be mindful of time. This presentation, actually, I thought it was going to be shorter, and it's not, which is okay, but I'll try to leave a couple of minutes for questions at the end. So I want to talk a little bit about some strategies and practice when it comes to coercive control. So trade-offs is one of them. Trade-offs are the skills that people who experience domestic abuse carry when they are making choices. It includes all kinds of choices like staying or leaving, and all of the factors that someone takes into consideration that can impact those decisions. Things like the social stigma, having children, having financial support. So people are weighing these all of the time. And by recognizing these trade-offs, we engage in a strength-based approach to providing support. So some of the examples of trade-offs, so the safety for self, for children, for friends and family, the financial stability, can I afford to leave? The access to domestic abuse resources in rural areas. Do I have the means to drive 3 hours to access a shelter? Do I even have a car that I can use? Employment. I have a supportive workplace or job that I can take off unexpected time off. Will they judge me if they learn that I'm experiencing abuse? Social stigma, the doubt, the fear, the shame, the guilt, the isolation that comes with this, the love for the person, right? There are all kinds of things that people are weighing out all the time when it comes to trade-offs. And sometimes those trade-offs are not worth leaving a relationship or ending a relationship. And we have to be really cognizant of that. Another strategy in practice is the notion of honoring resistance. So it's defined as a subtle but powerful way that someone resists abuse and coercive control. It can be a way for people to take back power and control for themselves. So, and this can be the smallest of things, right? This can be just the self-talk of saying, I don't deserve this. That is an act of honoring resistance. It can be other things like noticing that screaming for help or yelling when somebody's abusing, when the other person is abusing, it just increases the intensity. And so they become quiet and passive and don't interact when abuse is happening. For some people, right, that might be a cause to be like, you know, why aren't you fighting back? Why aren't you doing this? Right. But what actually that is an act of resistance, and honoring that resistance is huge when we talk about supporting people who are experiencing coercive control. This also can be things like, you know, hiding the keys from a partner who goes out when they you know, when they often are drinking, they also use violence or they use coercive control tactics, and so they might hide the keys so that the person can't drive anywhere, or so they can't go to the liquor store, right? And so there are all of these ways that a person is actively resisting the violence, the abuse, the coercive control that's happening to them. And that coercive control is more predictive of homicide than the existence of physical violence, right? And so when we're talking about strategies and practice, this is actually much more representative and predictive of really violent cases of coercive control or violent things of homicide than the existence of physical violence. So really quickly, I want to chat about a couple of policy considerations, because one of the things that Sagesse has been working on is we are trying to advocate to legislate coercive control. And in order for us to do that, we have to kind of understand what some of those policy considerations are. So the first one is, the idea of equity. So obviously, we probably know that equality is the aim to ensure that everyone gets the same things in order to enjoy full and healthy lives. Equity is to try to understand and give people what they need to enjoy healthy lives. So really, when it comes to using equity as a policy consideration, we say this because equality is frankly not good enough. For example, a limited definition of what domestic abuse is does not capture the serious harm being caused to folks. If we use an equality approach to intervention services and say that, for example, every person experiencing violence can use a shelter, well, this type of intervention service can be more harmful and not helpful to people in some cases. So we have to really recognize the difference between equality versus equity. Another piece is the gender transformative that I talked about before. So there is sort of a spectrum of experiences that people can experience when they are accessing resources. Gender exploitative is an intervention method that tends to focus on reinforcing or exploiting harmful norms, whereas gender transformative is a method that creates those opportunities to challenge those gender norms. We know that violence happens across a gender spectrum, and so we have to be able to recognize that as part of policy consideration. And then lastly, of course, we're talking about intersecting oppressions again, right? So we have to be able to acknowledge that people's intersecting oppressions and intersectionality plays a huge role in how people experience and what that looks like in terms of their coercive control. And so that, from a policy consideration, is something that we need to understand more and be looking at more to be able to legislate and look at legislating coercive control. Okay, I did those last few slides really quickly, so I apologize, but we are at the end. And so I think we have a couple of minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was incredible and very comprehensive. Never ceases to amaze me how, when we learn from subject matter experts, the ever unfolding layers of how deep abuse actually goes, and how easy it is to go undetected when people are simply not aware. So I commend you, and I thank you so much for the work that you're doing here with Sagesse, and also bringing that into a hands-on approach with people, and with people like us Quick question that I do have is when you are working primarily with, I guess the survivors or, at the present, people who are just discovering this might be happening to them. Typically, how is it that they discover that they've been actually affected by this? And our time actually just cut off, but you can do the answer. And when we do the replay, it'll come back up.
Okay. Sorry, just remind me of the question, Jessica.
Yes, the people that you help, how did they discover that this is something that they've undergone? When they're getting connected with you or finding their path really to you, what was the way that they managed to discover this was happening in their life?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that there's such a breadth of answer to that, because I think that people really have discovered it and sort of understood it in a lot of different ways. Sometimes, honestly, sometimes it's as simple as Googling something like, am I experiencing abuse? And if they are in our area, Calgary area, they probably are going to get a Google search that pops up with our name. And so they may choose to send a chat. We have a text and chat option on our website. They may send a chat and be like, hey, can I talk to somebody about this? So it might be as simple as that. Sometimes folks come to us and they've also said, I need to talk to somebody, but I don't even know if this is what I'm experiencing, right? And so a lot of the work that our social workers do is talking to folks about, this experience of coercive control, and not to say yes, you are experiencing it, but here's what we understand about coercive control, and do you see yourself in that experience, right? Is that something that fits with you? And a lot of the time folks are like, oh yeah, that is definitely something that fits in there, right? And so I feel like it often just starts from even just sort of a seed of something doesn't feel quite right, I don't know what it is. And then they are either getting, maybe talking to an informal supporter, or they're reaching out for a formal support, or it might be a really long process, right? It might be something that takes them a long time to kind of come towards, and they talk to people and then they're not sure, and it takes a while before that happens. So I think it can be a lot of different ways that looks. I don't know if that answers your question, but
huge. And it certainly did, I think, help to steer people who may be also wondering the same thing themselves, or know people that are experiencing it, but how to open that conversation.
Yeah.
Well, Amy, we are out of time, but thank you so much for this amazing content, for the real honed in work that you do. I learned a lot, even coming out of this experience my own self.
Yeah.
So this is very powerful, and I would love to get in touch with you more.
Absolutely.
And I'll follow up back with you separately from the Hope Conference box, because we do have a small little gift for you that we got to get your contact information.
Oh, okay.
So, but
well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. Please feel free to participate as an attendee in the rest of the conference, and you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good luck with the rest of your the conference. I hope it goes well, and thanks so much for having us. We really appreciate it.
Yes, you're so welcome. Thanks again. Bye-bye.